Tonight, we're going to the quiet town of Aberdeen in New South Wales, a place of small streets, coal mines, and the rhythmic hum of the local abattoir. The kind of place where everyone knows everyone, and nothing truly terrible is supposed to happen. But in the year 2000, something did. Police walked into a home on St Andrew Street expecting to find a missing man, and instead stepped into one of the most disturbing crime scenes in Australian history. A crime so shocking that seasoned detectives were physically sick. A crime that would lead to the first woman in Australia ever sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. But to understand how it happened, how a woman could go from a violent childhood to a string of abusive relationships to an act of brutality so extreme it defied imagination, we need to go back to the turbulent childhood shaped by violence, alcoholism, and abuse. Back to a girl who grew up surrounded by chaos, who learned early that blades and fear could get her what she wanted. Back through a series of relationships marked by assaults, threats, and escalating danger. And then to the final days of John Price, a hard-working father of three who knew he was in danger, who told his co-workers that if he didn't show up the next morning, it meant Katherine Knight had murdered him. And he was right. This is a story of generational trauma, unchecked violence, and a system that saw the signs over and over. Hospitals, police, psychiatric units. Yet somehow, she always walked free. Until the night she didn't. Tonight, you will hear the true story of Katherine Mary Knight. Her upbringing, her relationships, her crimes, and the night she crossed a line so horrific that the court would declare she should never, ever be released. My name's Jack Lawrence. Welcome to Crime at Bedtime. Before we head back to Australia, New South Wales, and the story of Katherine Knight, it's time to take a minute. Time to relax and focus on our breathing. As always, we'll utilise the 4-6-8 method. Breathing in slow and deep through the nose for 4 seconds, holding the breath for 6, before breathing out slow and controlled for 8. Here we go. Breathing in for 4. Hold. And slowly and controlled back out. And again, slowly breathing in deep, filling the lungs for 4. Holding. And slowly and controlled back out again. One more time, breathing in deep, slow, through the nose, filling the lungs for 4 seconds. Holding for 6. And slowly and controlled back out again. Now, as you breathe normally, let's delve into the disturbing case of Katherine Knight. Before Katherine Knight became the first woman in Australian history sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, she was a child growing up in one of the most chaotic and traumatic households imaginable. To understand how she ended up in a courtroom being told she would definitely never be released, we have to begin decades before the murder of John Price. Back in the 1950s in rural New South Wales, Katherine Mary Knight was born on the 24th of October 1955, in Tenterfield, one of a pair of twins. Her mother, Barbara, already had 4 sons from an earlier marriage to a man named John Jack Rogan. But by the time Katherine was born, Barbara was living with another man, Kenneth Charles Knight, a co-worker of her husband. Their relationship had started as an affair, and because the community in Aberdeen was so small and deeply conservative, the backlash was immediate. Barbara and Ken were forced to leave town, relocating to Moree. Her 4 Rogan boys did not come with her. The 2 eldest stayed with their father, and the 2 youngest were sent to extended family in Sydney. It was the first fracture in a family that would experience many. Barbara would eventually have 4 more children with Ken, including Katherine and her twin sister. But the new household was far from safe or stable. Ken was a violent alcoholic. According to accounts later accepted by psychiatrists and partially corroborated by family, he routinely assaulted Barbara, not only physically but sexually. Barbara, in turn, confided these details to her daughter. From an early age, Katherine grew up hearing about male violence, not in whispers, but in graphic descriptions from her own mother. The environment was volatile. Katherine later had alleged that she was also sexually assaulted by several family members, not including her father, until the age of 11. While some aspects of those allegations were never fully verified, psychiatrists would later determine there was enough corroboration from relatives to accept that abuse did occur. The home Katherine grew up in was defined by chaos, instability, and constant threats. Despite the turbulence at home, Katherine did form one close bond with her uncle, Oscar, a beloved horseman. He would later take his own life in 1969, and it devastated her. Katherine later claimed that Oscar's ghost visited her, an early indicator of the psychological difficulties that would follow her into adulthood. That same year, the family returned to Aberdeen. At school in Musselburgh, Katherine's behaviour was contradictory. Classmates remembered her as a loner and an unpredictable bully. She would physically intimidate younger students and assaulted at least one boy with a weapon. On one occasion, she was injured by a teacher, who was later found to have acted in self-defence. But when she wasn't in a rage, she could be quite polite, even exemplary. Teachers described moments of model behaviour. She even received awards for conduct. Yet socially, she remained isolated. And academically, she struggled. She left school at 15, unable to read or write. She took her first job at a clothing factory as a cutter. But it didn't last. Soon, she landed the position she would later describe as her dream job, working at the abattoir. It was here, surrounded daily by carcasses, blades, and blood, that Katherine seemed to find a sense of identity. She began working on offal, quickly moved to boning, and was eventually issued her own set of butcher's knives. This, to her, was a point of pride. Those knives would stay with her for years. She kept them hanging over her bed, first as a symbol of skill, then as a symbol of power, and later, according to her own words, so that they would always be handy if needed. It became one of the earliest, clearest warnings of what she was capable of. Residents of Aberdeen recalled her temper. If angered, Katherine could turn violent, without hesitation. Threats, intimidation, and physical aggression became familiar patterns. And it would be through work at the abattoir that she would meet the first of several men who would endure that pattern firsthand. By the early 1970s, Katherine's life had settled into a predictable cycle. Working at the abattoir during the day, volatility and conflict at home, and a growing reputation for unpredictable moods that could swing from calm to violent in an instant. But she was about to enter a new phase, one that involved relationships, marriage and motherhood. And with each relationship, the violence would escalate. Across the next 2 decades, 3 different partners would experience it. At least one would flee for his life. Another would be hospitalised. One would receive an apprehended violence order after Katherine claimed she feared him, despite being the one who attacked him repeatedly. And eventually, one of those men would die, in an act so gruesome that even seasoned detectives could not comprehend what they found. But in 1973, all of that was still far ahead. Katherine was 18, newly independent, confident in her work, and beginning her first serious relationship. And the people around her had no idea what she would one day become. By the time Katherine Knight entered her first marriage, the patterns that would define her adult life were already in place. The sudden rages, physical violence, threats, and a tendency to swing between affection and brutality without warning. But no one understood that better, or earlier, than David Stanford Kellett. Katherine met Kellett in 1973 at the abattoir in Aberdeen. He was 8 years her senior, a man already carrying severe trauma from his railway job in Coffs Harbour. He'd watched his best friend die in a shunting accident. He'd pulled children from the wreckage of a school bus after a collision with a train, an event that killed 6 students. Those images stayed with him, and heavy drinking became an escape. Kellett eventually lost his railway job, but he got work at the abattoir and soon became friends with Katherine's brother. He also discovered something unusual. If he got into a fight, Katherine would wade in beside him, not to calm things down, but to throw punches of her own. People took notice. She wasn't afraid of confrontation. In fact, she seemed to relish in it. In 1974, at Katherine's request, the two were married. They arrived at the wedding on her motorcycle, with Kellett drunk on the back. And then before the ceremony even started, Barbara, Katherine's mother, pulled him aside. Her warning was blunt. She told him that Katherine had something loose, that if he upset her or cheated on her, he would be in serious danger. She made it clear that her daughter was unpredictable. Kellett later said that the moment stuck with him. But by then, it was too late. On their wedding night, when Kellett fell asleep after they'd had sex 3 times, Katherine attacked him and tried to strangle him. When asked later why, she said it was because he had stopped too soon. Their relationship only escalated from there. During Katherine's pregnancy with their first child, she burned all of Kellett's clothes and shoes before striking him across the head with a frying pan because he'd come home late from a darts competition. The blow fractured his skull. He managed to escape to a neighbour's home and collapsed. Police were ready to charge Katherine, but she suddenly switched tactics, apologising, pleading, promising it would never happen again. And Kellett dropped the charges. And the violence continued. In May 1976, shortly after the birth of their daughter Melissa, Kellett finally fled, leaving for Queensland with another woman. Completely overwhelmed by Katherine's behaviour, what happened next showed how dangerously unstable she'd become. The day after Kellett left, Katherine was seen violently rocking her newborn in a pram down the main street. Witnesses said she was throwing the pram from side to side. She was taken to St Elmo's Hospital and diagnosed with postnatal depression. She spent several weeks there before she was released. Soon after returning home, Katherine placed 2-month-old Melissa on a railway track just minutes before a train was due. She then stole an axe and went into the town threatening to kill people. Only a homeless man, known as Old Ted, who happened to be foraging near the railway line, prevented the baby from being run over. He found her and rescued her moments before the train passed. Katherine was taken to hospital again and released the following day. Within days, she escalated even further. She slashed the face of a woman with one of her knives and demanded the woman drive her to Queensland to find Kellett. The woman managed to escape at a service station. By the time police arrived, Katherine had taken a young boy hostage. Officers eventually disarmed her by attacking her with a broom. She was then sent to a psychiatric hospital. There, she told nurses she intended to kill the mechanic at the service station because he'd repaired Kellett's car and allowed him to leave. She said she planned to kill Kellett and his mother too. When police informed Kellett, he left his girlfriend and returned to Aberdeen to support Katherine, effectively stepping back into danger. Katherine was released into the care of her mother-in-law in August of 1976. She and Kellett moved to Ipswich, Queensland, where she obtained work at the Dynmore Meatworks. In 1980, they had a second daughter, Natasha. And in 1984, the relationship ended permanently. Knight returned to Aberdeen, then settled in Muswellbrook. She went back to work at the abattoir, but a back injury the following year put her on a disability pension. She was moved into government housing. Then came another relationship and another escalation. She met David, a 38-year-old miner, in 1986. He moved in with her and her daughters, though he kept his own apartment. Katherine became extremely jealous, convinced he was cheating whenever she wasn't present. Arguments were constant. She threw him out repeatedly, then begged him to return. In 1987, during one of their fights, Katherine cut the throat of his 2-month-old dingo pup in front of him, as an example of what would happen if he ever had an affair. She then knocked him unconscious with a frying pan. Astonishingly, the pair had a daughter, Sarah, in 1988. Saunders had put a deposit on a house, and Katherine paid it off when her workers' compensation came through. She decorated the home with animal skulls, pelts, rusty traps, machetes and tools covering every wall and even the ceilings. When she later hit Saunders in the face with an iron and stabbed him in the stomach with scissors, he too fled and went into hiding. Knight went to police claiming she feared him, resulting in an AVO, despite Saunders being the one who had run for his life. In 1991, she began a relationship with a former abattoir co-worker, John Chillingworth. They had a son, Eric. The relationship lasted 3 years until Katherine left him for someone else, a man she had been seeing in secret, a man named John Price. And this time, the violence would end, not with hospitalisation or restraining orders, but with one of the most gruesome murders in Australian history. By the time Katherine Knight met John Charles Thomas Price in the early 1990s, she'd already left a trail of violence through every relationship she'd ever been in. But Price, known to everyone simply as Pricey, was well-liked, hard-working, a father of 3, and someone friends described as a terrific bloke. He'd ended his marriage in 1988, with his youngest daughter remaining with her mother, while his 2 older children lived with him. Pricey knew what Katherine's reputation was. Everyone in Aberdeen did. But his children liked her, and at first the relationship seemed manageable. Pricey earned good money working in the local mines, and the early days, despite frequent arguments, felt reasonably stable compared to Katherine's past relationships. However, by 1998 the cracks were widening. That year they fought after Pricey refused to marry her. Katherine retaliated in a way that cost him dearly. She videotaped items he had brought home from work, out-of-date medical kits he'd salvaged from the company tip, and then sent the footage to his employer. Technically, it was still company property, and Pricey was fired from his job of 17 years. The same day, he kicked Katherine out. But, as always happens with her partners, she returned. and he eventually allowed the relationship to restart. But this time he refused to let her move back in permanently. The fighting became constant. Friends warned him to stay away from her. Many refused to visit the house while Katherine was around. The tension steadily escalated into 2000. Then came February of that year, the beginning of the end. Katherine would stab Pricey in the chest during an argument. That was the moment he finally threw her out for good. On the 28th of February 2000, on the way to work, Pricey stopped at the magistrate's court and took out a restraining order to protect both himself and his children. That afternoon, he told his co-workers that if he didn't show up the next morning, it would be because Katherine Knight had murdered him. They begged him not to go home. He told them he feared that if he didn't return, she would kill his kids. When Pricey arrived home, Katherine wasn't there. But she had sent his children away for a sleepover. To him, it was a clear signal that she intended to be alone with him that night. Pricey spent the evening with neighbours before he returned home himself and went to bed at around 11 p.m. Meanwhile, Katherine had brought new black lingerie earlier that day. She'd also videotaped her children while making strange final-sounding comments, a recording later interpreted as a crude makeshift will. Sometime that night, she slipped into Pricey's house while he was asleep. She showered, then woke him. The pair had sex, after which Pricey fell asleep. It would be the last thing he ever did. Sometime before dawn on the 1st of March 2000, Katherine Knight retrieved the butcher's knife she had kept near the bed and stabbed John Price as he slept. Blood evidence later would show that Price woke up and tried to turn on the light. He attempted to flee, staggering through the hallway as Katherine chased him. He managed to get out the front door, but he either collapsed and fell back inside or was dragged back in and bled to death in the hallway. Police and forensic examiners later counted at least 37 stab wounds to the front and back of his torso. Many of them penetrated vital organs. The attack was prolonged, frenzied, and savage. After he died, Katherine Knight took his bank card and went into town. ATM records show she withdrew $1,000 from his account. And then she returned home and began the most horrifying part of the crime. A crime beyond comprehension. Using her skills from the years in the abattoir, Katherine skinned John Price. Not partially, but entirely. She removed his skin in one piece. From the face down to the legs, with professional precision. She then hung the full human skin from a meat hook on the architrave of a door in the lounge room, a hook she'd installed not long before. The skinned body was later found with the left arm placed over an empty soft drink bottle and the legs crossed. Forensic experts believed this was done as a deliberate act of defilement. She then decapitated Price and placed his head in a pot with vegetables and proceeded to cook it. The pot was still warm when police found it, estimated at between 40 and 50 degrees, meaning the cooking had taken place in the early morning hours. She also cooked parts of his body and arranged 2 full meals at the dinner table, complete with vegetables and gravy. Beside each plate, she placed a handwritten note, each note bearing the name of one of Price's 2 children. It was the clearest possible indication that she intended to feed Price's flesh to his own children. A 3rd meal was found discarded in the backyard. Investigators speculated that Knight may have attempted to eat it herself, but had been unable to continue. Beside a photograph of John Price, police found a handwritten note smeared with blood and pieces of flesh. The spelling was erratic and rage-filled. In the note, she made severe allegations that Jonathan had assaulted her daughter and others. Investigators later confirmed all accusations in the note were false. At 6 a.m, Price's neighbour had noticed his car was still in the driveway. When he didn't arrive at work, his employer sent someone to check on him. They saw blood on the front door and called police immediately. Officers forced entry through the back door. Inside, they found Katherine Knight unconscious in bed, having taken a large number of pills. Then, they entered the kitchen. The pot, the meals, the skin hanging from the doorway, and in the hallway, what remained of John Price. Even hardened investigators struggled with what they'd seen. After Katherine Knight was found unconscious in bed, it was apparent she'd attempted self-harm after the murder. But she was still alive. Paramedics transported her to hospital while detectives began processing what would become one of the most disturbing crime scenes in Australia's history. As investigators catalogued the evidence, the skin hanging from the architrave, the decapitated body, the warm pot containing Price's head, the 2 prepared meals set out for Price's children, there was no doubt about who had committed the murder. The brutality, the staging, the knife work, the notes beside the plates, it all, of course, pointed directly to Knight. Once medically stabilised, Knight was taken into custody. She claimed to have no memory of the events. Psychiatrists would later debate that point, with most accepting that she did suffer disassociation around traumatic or violent episodes, but also finding that she remained sane and consciously responsible for her actions. She initially attempted to plead guilty to manslaughter, but prosecutors rejected the offer immediately. The evidence of planning, escalation, and post-mortem mutilation was overwhelming. On the 2nd of March 2001, she was formally charged with the murder of John Charles Thomas Price. Her trial was set for the 23rd of July 2001, but had to be adjourned because her counsel became ill. The hearing was rescheduled for the 15th of October 2001 at the New South Wales Supreme Court. When jury selection began, Justice Barry O'Keefe warned the 60 prospective jurors that they would be shown graphic photographic evidence. He offered them the option of withdrawing on that basis. 5 immediately accepted. Several more dropped out as the witness list was read aloud, revealing the scale and nature of the case. The remaining jurors were impaneled, but they would never hear the evidence. After the jury was seated, Knight's lawyers requested an adjournment. When court resumed the following morning, Knight unexpectedly changed her plea to guilty. The courtroom was stunned. This was the first time she'd accepted responsibility in any form. Justice O'Keefe later revealed he had been notified about the plea change the previous afternoon and immediately ordered an overnight psychiatric evaluation to ensure she fully understood the consequences of what she was doing. Several psychiatrists examined her, and they concluded that she was fit to plead. That despite her dissociative claims, she was aware of her actions and the legal significance of them. Knight's defense had originally planned to argue that she suffered amnesia and disassociation. 2 psychiatrists believed she displayed features consistent with borderline personality disorder, but none found her legally insane. Even after entering the guilty plea, Knight continued to deny responsibility, insisting she could not remember the events. Because she had pled guilty, there was no need for a trial. Instead, the case moved straight to sentencing. During the hearing, Knight's lawyers asked the judge to excuse her from the courtroom during certain details of the forensic testimony, particularly the evidence relating to the skinning, decapitation, and post-mortem staging. But Justice O'Keefe refused. When forensic pathologist Timothy Lyons described the skinning of Price's body, Knight became hysterical and had to be seated. The court then heard about the scene in its final clinical detail. Justice O'Keefe described the murder as appalling in almost its unimaginable brutality, an offence that shocked even veteran investigators. On the 8th of November 2001, the sentence was handed down. Katherine Knight became the first woman in Australian history to receive life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Her prison documents were marked with the order, never to be released. Justice O'Keefe cited the extreme violence, the deliberate mutilation, the complete lack of remorse, and the profound danger she posed to the public as a reason for the unprecedented sentence. He emphasised that the crime was so horrific that releasing her at any point would undermine public trust in the justice system. Knight showed no visible emotion when the sentence was read. In June of 2006, she appealed her sentence, arguing that life without parole was manifestly excessive. The case went before the New South Wales Court of Criminal Appeal, where 3 justices, Peter McLennan, Michael Adams and Megan Latham, considered the argument, but the appeal was dismissed. Justice McLennan said the murder was appalling and well beyond the worst category of murder. The sentence stood. Knight was sentenced to Silverwater Women's Correctional Centre in Sydney, where she remains today. Reports from inside the prison suggest she has become a stabilising figure among inmates, someone who meditates disputes rather than causes them. Staff records show no violent incidents while in custody, a stark contrast to her life outside prison. But none of that changed the outcome of her sentencing. Her behaviour had been considered during the appeal. The court still deemed her crime too extreme to ever justify release. John Price remains one of the most gruesome and infamous criminal cases in Australian history. It's taught in criminology courses, referenced in debates about domestic violence and mental health, and remembered in the legal profession as the case that broke precedent on sentencing. For the Price family, the horror of that night never faded. Friends remembered Price as a kind, hard-working man who knew he was in danger but couldn't bring himself to abandon his children to what he feared Katherine might do. His warnings to co-workers, "If I don't come in tomorrow, it's because she killed me," proved tragically accurate. Katherine Knight will die behind bars, and the town of Aberdeen, once known for its abattoir and small-town quiet, will forever be associated with a crime that defies belief. A crime committed by a woman who learned early in life how to butcher animals, and eventually used that skill in the most horrifying way imaginable. Crime at Bedtime is a Mashed Pumpkin production. Created, hosted and produced by Jack Lawrence. Audio and sound design by Jack Lawrence of Mashed Pumpkin Productions and Dom Evans and James Costa of Earsay.